Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're inviting you to completely rethink how you look at the world map. Forget the traditional lines of countries, the mountain ranges, the winding rivers for a second. What if the most crucial strategic battlefields, the real highways of global destiny, are actually the vast, often overlooked expanses of the world's oceans?
Right.
We so often think of maps in two dimensions, right? Focused on the land masses. But what if the most vital strategic points, the critical arteries of power, are actually liquid? It's a perspective that, well, once you see it, it kind of reshapes everything.
It absolutely does. I mean, while we commonly focus on, terrestrial boundaries and land-based conflicts, history consistently reminds us that the seas have always been critical for human civilization, global trade, and crucially, the projection of power.
Exactly.
And today we're going to unpack precisely why that is, looking through the lens of one of history's most influential and maybe most misunderstood strategic thinkers.
That's right. Today, our deep dive takes us into the profound and surprisingly enduring influence of a 19th century American naval officer and historian, Alfred Thayer Mahan.
Yeah.
He championed a concept, sea power, that, well, for a period it seemed to fade from the forefront of strategic thought. But now, it's experiencing a very significant resurgence.
Definitely.
His ideas are actively shaping the strategies of some of the most powerful nations on Earth, even as others are sort of reevaluating their own approaches.
And our primary guide for this exploration, the core of our understanding today, comes from powerful excerpts from Robert D. Kaplan's insightful book, The Revenge of Geography.
Great source.
Kaplan does an excellent job, I think, of unearthing Mahan's genius while also critically examining his blind spots. It gives us a really robust framework for understanding Mahan's lasting legacy and, well, why his ideas are so relevant right now.
So our mission in this deep dive is clear for you, our listener. We want to unpack Mahan's core arguments about sea power, understand how his ideas may be contrasted with other major geopolitical thinkers of his time, explore the nuances and critiques of his complex thinking,
Yeah, it's definitely complex.
and most importantly, discover why his theories, penned over a century ago, are resonating more powerfully than ever in today's shifting global landscape. Get ready to see the world map in a whole new way, understanding the watery highways that truly dictate global power and how that understanding is playing out in real time. Okay, so to really get Mahan, we need to set the historical stage a bit. Imagine yourself back in the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
Right.
This wasn't just an era of cool inventions like electric lights and telephones. It was a period of massive transformative change, particularly with the Industrial Revolution just roaring across the globe.
Huge.
And this revolution didn't just transform factories and daily life. It fundamentally reshaped military thinking, how nations viewed their strength, and crucially, how they projected that power around the world.
That's a critical starting point. The advent of new technologies, things like widespread rail networks, steamships, better road transport, it really prompted a shift in strategic thought for many. Thinkers like the British geographer Halford Mackinder, for instance, he began to emphasize the paramount importance of land power.
Mackinder, yeah. The heartland theory.
Exactly. His concept of the heartland of Eurasia, that vast, central, seemingly impenetrable landmass, stretching from Eastern Europe across Russia and Central Asia, became, in his view, the geographical pivot for empires.
The pivot point.
He saw it as the ultimate source of power because of its central location and the newfound ability to move forces and resources efficiently across land, seemingly, beyond the reach of traditional naval power.
So, while Mackinder was looking inward, kind of drawing a line around this vast continental core,
Simultaneously, the very same Industrial Revolution, particularly its staggering impact on shipbuilding, steam power, global trade, it propelled an American Navy captain, Alfred Thayer Mahan, into real prominence.
right, Mahan steps onto the scene.
Mahan, yeah. A slightly older contemporary of Mackinder was looking outward. And he arrived at a vastly fundamentally different conclusion about the true source of global dominance. Sea power.
Completely different conclusion.
It's a fascinating divergence, isn't it? Born from the same technological route, yet pointing in entirely opposite strategic directions.
It is a profound divergence. I mean, while Mackinder saw power coming from that continental core, Mahan was utterly convinced that control of the oceans was the ultimate determinant of global influence.
Okay.
For him, the ability to command the seas wasn't just a military advantage. It was the bedrock of national wealth, security, and even maybe paradoxically, international stability. It's an interesting concept to explore. So, if Mackinder was gazing inward at the vastness of land, Mahan was fixed on that endless horizon of the oceans. What made him so convinced that sea power was superior? What was his core premise? That fundamental difference he saw?
Mahan's fundamental premise was, well, it was multi-layered. He argued that sea power was not only more important than land power in the fight for dominance,
Okay.
but he went a step further. He suggested it was less threatening to international stability.
Less threatening. That's surprising for a naval guy.
It is, right. But his reasoning was based on the limited capacity of navies to extend coercive force inland. That, he said, makes them no menace to liberty.
Huh. Explain that a bit more.
Well, think of it this way. A navy can blockade your ports, sure. It can stop trade, maybe even launch missiles or project some forces inland.
Right.
But unlike a massive army, it typically can't occupy vast swaths of land, plant a flag in your capital, and, govern a population.
Oh, okay. The occupation piece is missing.
Exactly. That inherent limitation, the inability to occupy and directly subjugate on land, made sea power, in Mahan's view, more a tool of influence and economic leverage rather than outright conquest, a subtle but, profound difference in how it's applied.
That's a truly insightful distinction influence without necessarily becoming a direct occupier.
Yeah.
Changes the nature of power projection entirely. And Mahan didn't just propose his own theory in a vacuum. He directly countered Mackinder's powerful heartland idea.
He did.
For Mahan, it wasn't the Eurasian interior that was the geographical pivot of empires. So what was it for him? What did he see as the true hinges of geopolitical destiny?
Conversely, for Mahan, it was the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Those constituted the hinges of geopolitical destiny.
The oceans themselves?
Yes. He envisioned these vast watery expanses as the critical avenues, the essential conduits for global power. He saw maritime nations projecting influence and power around what he called the Eurasian rimland, the coastal edges of the supercontinent.
The rimland, okay.
And this influence would then affect political developments deep into Central Asia, but not through direct land invasion, mind you.
Right.
It was thanks to the same rail and road feeder networks that Mackinder focused on for land power.
Wait, so he saw sea power using the land network?
Exactly. In a fascinating interplay, Mahan saw sea power leveraging land infrastructure to extend its reach and influence, not replace it. So the very land networks Mackinder emphasized were, in Mahan's view, also serving as sort of capillaries for seaborne influence.
Wow.
Proving that it's not simply an either scenario, it's integrated.
That's a truly aha moment right there. The very land networks Mackinder emphasized for land power were, in Mahan's view, also serving as capillaries for seaborne influence. It's not one or the other, but an integrated, almost symbiotic system.
Precisely.
And this interaction, this foundational idea of the rimland as a crucial area, became incredibly influential, didn't it?
Oh, hugely influential. You see this connection come full circle decades later with Nicholas Spikeman.
Spikeman, right. Another big geopolitical thinker.
Yeah, a prominent American strategist. Spikeman was profoundly influenced by both Mahan and Mackinder, and he ultimately focused his own emphasis on that rimland surrounding the Indian and Pacific Oceans.
Willing on both.
Exactly. It demonstrates how these foundational ideas didn't just exist in isolation, they built upon each other, creating a layered, more nuanced understanding of global strategy that, frankly, continues to inform policy today. It's a testament to the enduring nature of geographical realities.
Now, Mahan wasn't just theorizing about abstract concepts. He was a keen observer of geopolitics, a historian applying his ideas to specific nations and their inherent geographical situations. And one of his most striking insights, one that still echoes today in geopolitical discussions, was about Russia.
Indeed. While Mackinder, as we discussed, was sort of awed by the strength of Russia given its control of the heartland, Mahan, whose book The Problem of Asia actually came out 4 years before Mackinder's famous Geographical Pivot article, he espied Russia's vulnerability. He looked at the map differently and saw a fundamental strategic weakness.
Okay, what was that vulnerability? What did he see that Mackinder, from his land-centric view, perhaps missed? And how did he connect it to Russia's behavior?
Mahan pointed directly to Russia's irremediable remoteness from an open sea as a significant, almost, insurmountable disadvantage.
No easy access to warm water ports.
Exactly. He argued this hindered its accumulation of wealth because access to global trade routes, the ease of maritime commerce, it was all severely constrained.
Okay.
But then he made a critical psychological leap. He suggested that this persistent dissatisfaction readily takes the form of aggression.
Wow, that's a big leap.
It's a powerful, if maybe controversial, argument. that deep-seated physical constraints rooted in geography can drive national behavior, even shaping what he called the deepest psychological currents based, in fact, on geography of the Russian national character.
So he's saying Russia's historic drive for warm water ports, it's expansionism.
Was, in his view, a direct consequence of this geographical frustration.
Fascinating. A physical limit leading to a psychological trait, fueling a strategic imperative, echoing through centuries of policy. So if Russia's land power was, in Mahans' view, kind of contained by this lack of reliable sea access, where then did Mahan see the flashpoints? Where was the debatable ground for future conflicts?
Mahan called the nations lying south of Russia and north of the Indian Ocean the debatable ground of Asia.
Debatable ground.
He defined it precisely as the zone of conflict between Russian land power and British sea power at that time. And just as a quick historical side note, this is the exact area Spikeman would later relabel as the Rimland.
Ah, there's the Rimland again.
Building directly on Mahan's initial insight into this crucial strategic buffer zone.
It's incredible how these terms echo through history, still so relevant. And within this debatable ground, Mahan identified specific pivotal states, key players in this land-sea struggle. Which nations did he pinpoint?
He identified China, Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey as key pivotal states within this zone.
China, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey. Still sounds pretty familiar.
Right. It's truly no coincidence, as Kaplan notes, that he could identify states of such profound geopolitical significance way back in 1900 that remain absolutely critical in our own time.
Why?
The reason, Kaplan emphasizes, is simple. Geography is unchangeable. The physical layout of the world, it stays constant. And therefore, its strategic implications often endure, making Mahan's foresight remarkably prescient.
And we've seen this play out in countless ways, haven't we? I mean, think about the Cold War.
Exactly. Geography helped dictate a containment strategy against the Soviet Union from the southern tier of Eurasian states during the Cold War. That strategy explicitly involved all these Rimland nations Mahan had identified.
How so?
Well, you had Turkey as a NATO flank, Iran, Afghanistan, others becoming front lines against Soviet expansion. And if we connect this to today, geography continues to help determine the importance of China, right?
Yeah.
A state extending from the heartland to the warm waters of the Pacific Rim. Similarly, it explains why Afghanistan and Iran are still two heartland nations critical to the destiny of the Middle East. Their positions, bridging land and sea influence, their resources, choke points, they're timeless strategic assets.
And Mahan didn't just look at those border nations. He placed a huge, almost central emphasis on India, didn't he? It wasn't just part of the Rimland for him. It was something more.
He did. Mahan highlighted India's critical role. Located in the center of the Indian Ocean littoral, with its rear flanks protected by the Himalayan mountain system.
Almost an impregnable base.
Pretty much. Essential for seaward penetration of both the Middle East and China. It's a key hub for maritime influence across vast regions, controlling vital sea lanes.
Right.
And here's where it gets really interesting and directly impacts our everyday language.
Oh, yeah.
It was Mahan who, in 1902, first used the term Middle East to denote the area between Arabia and India.
No way. Mahan coined Middle East.
Yes. He specifically highlighted its particular importance for naval strategy because of its position between European and Asian empires. So that common term we use constantly, it has a surprising origin rooted directly in naval strategic thought.
That's wild. It reminds us how even our vocabulary is shaped by geopolitical thinking. So if sea power was the key to influencing these vital Eurasian regions, how did a geographically distant United States fit into this complex power struggle, especially in what Mackinder called a closed system?
Mahan believed that sea power provides the Mahanian means by which a distant United States can influence Eurasia in a Mackinder-esque closed system.
Okay, unpack that.
It suggests that while Mackinder saw Eurasia as this self-contained land system, kind of impenetrable to outside influence,
Right.
Mahan provided the mechanism for an outside power like the U.S. to project influence into that system, not through direct land invasion, but via the sea.
Using the oceans as highways.
Exactly. The oceans, for Mahan, were the global conduits for power projection, allowing even geographically distant nations to become major players and essentially break down the closed nature of the Eurasian landmass.
Now, no grand theory, no matter how influential, is without its critics or its blind spots.
Yeah.
Mahan's ocean-centric view wasn't universally accepted, and history itself, particularly the, brutal 20th century, would ultimately test his premises in pretty unexpected ways.
That's a crucial point to acknowledge. Robert Strauss-Hupé, in his significant work Geopolitics, offered a powerful critique of Mahans' view.
Strauss-Hupé. Okay, what was his take?
He explained that Britain and the United States clung to the doctrine of Mahan, seeing it as so appealing because it promised security and business as usual, a focus on trade and maritime defense rather than massive, costly land armies.
Made sense for island nations.
Right, but, Strauss-Hupé argued, this adherence inadvertently gave Germany just that breathing space she needed for organizing total war on the continent.
So relying too heavily on sea power meant potentially overlooking the land threat, especially from a rising continental power like Germany. That sounds like a critical strategic flaw, especially heading into the world wars.
It was. Mahan's sea-powered doctrine, while aggressive in its own way and focused on grand Eurasian security, did not sufficiently take into account the ability of a land power to quickly lay siege to Europe, from Iberia to the Urals.
Right. Blitzkrieg wasn't really on his radar yet.
Exactly. This highlights a real blind spot in his otherwise comprehensive theory. He perhaps underestimated the speed and destructive power of modern land warfare. However, it's important to add a layer of nuance here because Mahan was a sophisticated thinker.
Okay.
He did cover his tracks to some extent. He wrote that the due use and control of the sea is but one link in the chain of exchange by which wealth accumulates.
So he knew it wasn't everything.
Right. He understood the broader economic context and that sea power wasn't the only factor, but it was, for him, the primary one.
That's an important clarification. He wasn't entirely monolithic. But still, Strauss-Hupé observed a lusty imperialism in Mahan's thinking. He seemed to envision American power extending far beyond its own shores, which was a pretty radical idea for the U.S. back then.
He certainly did.
Yeah.
Mahan envisioned American power beyond just sea to shining sea manifest destiny. He saw it extending to domination of the Caribbean and the Pacific, aiming to make the United States the world's preponderant power.
Preponderant power, not just defense.
No, this was about global influence. He famously held that a nation must expand or decline, for it was impossible for a nation to hold its own while standing still.
Expand or decline. Stark choice.
And from a tactical perspective, Mahan was often similarly unnuanced, believing strongly in concentration of naval power through battle fleet supremacy, a massed fleet of line of battleships. His ideal was a powerful, concentrated fleet ready for decisive, overwhelming battle, kind of a single hammer blow to achieve dominance.
But to simply label Mahan as a rigid imperialist or a one-dimensional tactician, as some might, that feels like a caricature. Right? Yeah. The man published 19 books in 20 years. He was clearly a complex, prolific thinker.
Absolutely.
What were some of those less-known facets of his character and philosophy?
Yeah, Kaplan emphasizes that Mahan is hard to pin down. A lusty imperialism was just one side of him. There was far more depth there.
Like what?
For instance, he was a Democrat who openly preferred democratic to monarchical rule.
Okay.
Even while observing that democracies are not friendly to military expenditures.
A practical observation.
Right. It reveals a practical, maybe even cynical, understanding of political systems. Democracies prioritize domestic spending, often at the expense of military readiness, which he saw as a potential strategic vulnerability.
So he saw the benefits of democracy, but recognized a potential inherent weakness in terms of military readiness, especially in a competitive world. That's significant. And he didn't necessarily advocate for an American fleet that had to stand alone against everyone, did he?
No, surprisingly, he didn't. He didn't necessarily feel a massive fleet was absolutely necessary for the United States acting in isolation.
Really?
Rather, he believed the U.S. should cooperate with Great Britain since naval supremacy was only possible through a coalition.
Wow. Cooperation with Britain. Yeah. That's a much more flexible approach.
It is. It shows a much more pragmatic approach to achieving global sea power than he's often given credit for, anticipating the need for alliances.
And philosophically, what about war itself?
Philosophically, Mahan considered war an unnatural condition of nations.
Unnatural.
Yeah, but one which they, nevertheless, had to tragically prepare for. He saw military preparedness not as a desire for conflict, but as a grim necessity for peace. And he even foresaw a multinational system of maritime alliances to guard the global commons.
Guarding the commons. Sounds almost modern.
It does. So yeah, it is truly important not to caricature him. His thinking was far more sophisticated than just build big ships and dominate.
Despite these debates and the nuances, Mahan's central thesis on the unchanging principles of naval war had a monumental impact. His big book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660-1783,
Yeah.
published in 1890, that really changed the game, right? Not just for the U.S., but globally.
Oh, absolutely. Monumental impact. That book directly affected the thinking of Presidents William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, key architects of modern American foreign policy.
Teddy Roosevelt, definitely.
And also Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was obsessed with challenging British naval supremacy, and it helped prompt the naval build-up prior to World War I. It truly shaped an era of naval expansion and competition.
How did he make his case so powerfully?
Mahans showed that because the sea is the great highway or wide common of civilization, naval power, the power to protect merchant fleets, had always been the determining factor in global political struggles, especially because both travel and traffic by water have always been easier and cheaper than by land.
The economics of it.
Right. The strength of his argument lay as much in its originality as in its comprehensiveness. He really synthesized these historical patterns in an unprecedented way, presenting this compelling, sweeping narrative of maritime history.
And what were some of Mahans' key precepts from this work? Specific warnings or insights for nations?
Well, he asserted that a peaceful, game-loving nation is not far-sighted, and far-sightedness is needed for adequate military preparation.
A warning against complacency.
Exactly. Not a call for aggression, but a stark warning in an often brutal world. He wasn't championing despotism either, quite the opposite. He pointed out that because of despotism and fierce avarice, that neither Spain nor Portugal, despite being great sea powers, were in the final analysis great nations.
So greatness needs more than just might.
For him, yes. True national greatness involved a moral foundation. Yet he still posed the tough question. Whether a democratic government will have the foresight, the keen sensitiveness to national position necessary to deter adversaries, that's an open question.
Doubting democracy's long-term strategic vision.
He warned that friendly foreign ports do not always endure, implying alliances and access could vanish. He believed nations at peace are ignorant of the tragedy that comes from not cultivating a tragic sensibility, a real awareness of potential threats, the inherent dangers. It was a call to perpetual sober vigilance.
So perpetual vigilance, even in peacetime. Understand that the absence of conflict doesn't mean the absence of threat. And he really stressed the importance of historians understanding the sea, almost like they were missing a massive piece of the puzzle.
Oh, profoundly. He lamented that historians were ignorant of the sea, unaware of the vast expanses of the earth that exert so much influence on the dry land regions and contribute to their security and prosperity.
They focus too much on land.
Yeah. Land battles, treaties, missing the oceanic undercurrents of power. This is precisely why he deemed it urgent to write about the history of naval war, to fill that intellectual gap.
And his crucial point, the pillar of his legacy,
was that the principles of such war have remained constant, despite the technological advances from oared galley to steamship, and, he might add, to nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines in our day. The platforms change, but the strategic imperatives, the principles of controlling the sea, remain timeless.
So technology changes, but the fundamental principles don't. How did he illustrate this? He used a compelling analogy, didn't he, to make it graspable?
He used a powerful land-bound army analogy that makes it incredibly clear. He said, okay, when the march on foot was replaced by carrying troops in coaches, then by railroads.
Faster movement.
Right. The scale of distances was increased, or if you will, the scale of time diminished. But the principles which dictated the point at which the army should be concentrated, the direction in which it should move, the part of the enemy's position which it should assail, the protection of communications, were not altered.
The core strategy stayed the same.
Exactly. He argued the same logic applies to naval power. Ships change from sail to steam to nuclear, speed increases, range expands, but the core strategic objectives, controlling sea lanes, protecting commerce, denying the enemy access, remain constant. It's a foundational truth he uncovered.
That's a great analogy. It really makes it relatable. And he didn't just focus on the sailing ship era, right? He went way back in history to prove his points.
He did. His panoramic commentary went much further back. He showed how Roman control of the water that forced Hannibal to that long, perilous march through Gaul, in which more than half his veteran troops wasted away.
So naval control shaped a land campaign.
Precisely. Not a naval battle, but naval control having a decisive impact. He pointed out that during the Second Punic War, the Roman legions passed by water, unmolested and unwearied, between Spain, which was Hannibal's base, and Italy.
While Hannibal had to march overland.
Exactly. There are no great sea battles in the Second Punic War because Rome's mastery of the Mediterranean was a deciding factor in Carthage's defeat. This powerfully illustrates his point. Sea power isn't always about dramatic battles. Sometimes it's about denying mobility, controlling communications, enabling your own forces, shaping the whole strategic environment.
That Roman example really solidifies it. Control and advantage, not always overt conflict. And he had a powerful, almost poetic analogy for the sea itself, didn't he? Something to help us understand why we might undervalue navies.
He did. Mahan famously compared the sea to a desert.
A desert?
Yeah, he wrote, if the Mediterranean Sea were a flat desert, a dominant navy is the force capable of traveling back and forth across the desert from one mountain range to another at will. This was the case with Rome.
Okay, I see the analogy now. Freedom of movement across an empty space.
Right. He then mused that because water is a strange element and sailors from time immemorial a strange race apart, we don't hold navies in the high regard that we should.
We don't appreciate them enough.
He called the Navy essentially a light corps that keeps open the communications between its own ports, it obstructs those of the enemy, but it sweeps the sea for the service of the land, it controls the desert that man may live and thrive on the habitable globe.
Controls the desert that man may live and thrive on the habitable globe. That's a powerful image. Makes the abstract role of naval power incredibly vivid. And Mahan famously defined true naval power beyond just sinking individual ships. What was the ultimate goal?
He put it clearly, it is not the taking of individual ships or convoys that is crucial. Rather, it is the possession of that overbearing power on the sea which drives the enemy's flag from it or allows it to appear only as a fugitive that is so important.
Overbearing power. Complete dominance.
That's the ultimate goal, not just winning battles, but establishing such clear dominance that the enemy cannot even contest the seas. And he also spoke to the inherent geographic advantage for maritime powers.
Like Britain or the U.S.
Exactly. If a nation be so situated that it is neither forced to defend itself by land, nor induced to seek extension of its territory by way of the land, it has, by the very unity of its aim directed upon the sea, an advantage as compared with a people one of whose boundaries are continental.
They can focus outwards.
He cited England and America as being so situated, both experiencing long periods of global power. Their island or quasi-island positions allowed them to focus their strategic energies seaward without the constant drain of land defense.
So Mahan clearly saw America as uniquely positioned for sea power, implying this position gave it an inherent advantage, shielding it from European land conflicts.
Right.
But he also recognized some inherent geographical challenges for the United States, didn't he? It wasn't all smooth sailing, so to speak.
He absolutely did. America is indeed a massive, well-endowed, virtual island in the temperate zone, independent of the debilitating power struggles in Eurasia. That insular position shielded it.
Huge advantage.
Huge. However, this advantageous position also posed a significant challenge. A yawning distance from Eurasian ports, especially in the Pacific. This distance inhibits its ability to exert influence over them. So, while secure, it was also somewhat isolated from the main theaters of global power projection, especially back then with slower travel.
And this is precisely where the idea of the Panama Canal comes in. Something Mahan foresaw with remarkable clarity as a true game changer. How did he predict this transformative project would fundamentally alter America's strategic landscape and its role in the world?
Mahan foresaw in his book that building a Central American canal in Panama would bring American merchant and war fleets into greater contact with both ends of Eurasia.
Shrinking the world.
Essentially, yes. He acknowledged the enormous expense this would entail, but he predicted the real effect of the Panama Canal will be the transformation of the Caribbean from a terminus and place of local traffic into one of the great highways of the world.
A global highway.
Allowing ships of not only the U.S. but also European nations to transit between the Atlantic and Pacific, significantly cutting travel times, fostering global connectivity in a way previously unimaginable.
So it wasn't just about American power projection, it was about transforming global traffic patterns.
Yeah.
And he predicted a major, almost unavoidable shift in U.S. foreign policy as a direct result.
Indeed. With this new global artery, Mahan predicted it will not be so easy as heretofore for the United States to stand aloof from international complications.
The end of easy isolationism.
He saw the canal making isolationism increasingly untenable, forcing America onto the global stage. Mahan also recognized that geography, which makes the Isthmian Canal possible in the first place, also necessitates closer ties between the United States and its Central American and Caribbean neighbors in order to protect the canal and control the seas nearby.
A strategic imperative to secure the approaches.
Absolutely. The long-term effect, he believed, would be to make America physically closer to Asia and more involved with Europe through shipping, which would help affect the eventual enfeeblement of isolationism and the consequent rise of a muscular liberal internationalism in the corridors of power in Washington. It was basically a blueprint for America's future as a global player.
This is a truly key point for understanding American history.
Hmm.
Was America's rise to global power purely geographical destiny, or was there more at play? Because it sounds like Mahan saw the geographical opportunities, but also recognized the choice involved in seizing them.
Kaplan makes it abundantly clear. It certainly wasn't destiny, despite the commanding role of geography. The Panama Canal, for all its geographical logic, was the upshot of several phenomena, all involving human agency.
Human agency, okay.
This is where human will, ingenuity, strategic decision-making, that's what comes into play. Geography provides the stage, but humans write the play.
So it wasn't just, hey, there's a narrow strip of land, let's cut it. There were complex political, diplomatic, human factors that had to align. What were some examples of that human agency?
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. The Spanish-American War, which gave the U.S. new territories and strategic interests.
Right.
The great power politics that ultimately denied any European nation a role in the project, ensuring American control. The backroom deal-making that resulted in the choice of Panama over Nicaragua, a decision fraught with political intrigue.
Phantom over Nicaragua, yeah.
The conquest of disease in the Central American tropics, which was a massive engineering and medical feat. And above all, immense labor and ingenuity from thousands of workers.
So many human factors.
All products of human decision-making, diplomatic maneuvering, monumental effort. So once again, geography provides the backdrop for what human choice arranges. It's a profound distinction. Geography creates opportunities and limits, but it's human action that ultimately shapes destiny.
That's a crucial nuance. Geography offers potential, but human will is the engine of change. Mahan, then, wasn't just observing. He was actively trying to shape that human choice, to nudge America toward its maritime destiny.
Precisely. Mahan clearly seeks to influence human choice. His book was published at such a pivotal time for the U.S. after consolidating the continent, just before gaining Spain's empire.
Perfect timing.
His work was a call to arms through global sea power, urging America to embrace its maritime potential. So while he was not so much a geographer as a historian and tactician, he represented an imperialistic sensibility which carries with it obvious geographical implications.
And that influenced Spikeman, too.
Exactly. That's the decisive explanation for Spikeman's high regard for him. Spikeman, who wasn't really an enthusiast of conquest, still intuitively grasped, as Mahan did, that America would have no choice but to engage in worldwide power struggles because of its own geographically privileged position.
Its island position gave it influence
In the Western Hemisphere, which gave it influence in the Eastern Hemisphere. America's unique geography, in this view, made global engagement almost inevitable.
Okay, so of course, a thinker as impactful, as bold, and as influential as Mahan was bound to have strong intellectual enemies. Vocal critics.
Naturally.
One of the most articulate and prominent was Sir Norman Angell, a British journalist and politician. What was his fundamental challenge to Mahan's thinking, particularly the more imperialistic parts?
Sir Norman Angell, a strong proponent of pacifism, published The Great Illusion back in 1909. It was a spirited defense of pacifism.
A great illusion.
And in it, he famously condemns Mahan's writings as very mischievous moonshine. Angell was fundamentally opposed to the idea that war, imperial expansion, or great power competition were logical or beneficial. He thought they were economically irrational and morally indefensible.
And what was the core of his argument against Mahan's assertions about expanding national authority? He wasn't just saying war is bad. He was critiquing the very premise of state power.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Angell denounces Mahan's assertion that the extension of national authority over alien communities can be a dignified enterprise. He argued that, like individuals, nations, and empires have souls as well as bodies, implying a moral and ethical dimension to state behavior.
A soul for the state.
For Angell, Mahan was absurdly denying the very tangible reality of the individual and replacing him with a comparatively intangible reality of the state. He felt Mahan glorified the state and its power at the expense of human dignity, individual worth, reducing people to mere cogs in a machine.
He hit some very pointed questions to illustrate this, didn't he? Questions challenging the idea of national greatness based on size or military power.
Yes, Angel famously asked, does anyone think of paying deference to the Russian mujik because he happens to belong to one of the biggest empires territorially?
Good question.
Does anyone think of despising an Ibsen, the great Norwegian playwright, or any educated Scandinavian or Belgian or Hollander because they happen to belong to the smallest nations in Europe?
Point taken. Individual worth isn't tied to empire size.
That was his powerful way of saying individual value, the quality of a society, aren't determined by the state's size, military might, or reach. He saw Mahan, and by inference Spikeman and Mackinder, as determinists and essentialists all.
Determinists.
Yeah, whose warlike tendencies emerged from their seeing, as the philosopher Isaiah Berlin complained, nations and empires as more real than the individuals who encompass them. A profound critique of realism.
That's a powerful critique, accusing them of prioritizing the abstract state over concrete human lives.
Yeah.
But Kaplan, in The Revenge of Geography, offers a sort of counterpoint, a Haushofer defense, suggesting a darker, more pragmatic reality.
He does. Kaplan suggests that if thinkers like Mahan did not engage in the sort of determinism which Angel condemns, if they didn't grapple with the harsh realities of power politics,
Then what?
they would leave the field of grand strategy to those who are truly evil. He concludes with a provocative thought, alas, we require the moral imperfections of the likes of a Mahan.
Wow, we require their moral imperfections.
It implies that a pragmatic, even if morally imperfect, strategic realism is necessary to navigate a dangerous world, lest others fill the void with truly malicious intent. It's a challenging idea about the necessity of engaging with strategic realities, even the uncomfortable ones, to prevent worse outcomes.
And the historical irony here is pretty stark, given Angel's book, The Great Illusion, arguing against the rationality of war. Published right before World War I.
Just awful timing.
Brutal timing. His thesis was immediately put to the most savage test imaginable.
It is. Angel's treatise suffered the misfortune of being published only a few years before World War I, which initiated a century of unprecedented war and conflict in Europe. Angel unfairly became a laughingstock in many quarters as a result, his name synonymous with naive optimism.
Unfairly, you think?
Well, Kaplan clarifies that Angel's book was compulsively readable and brilliantly argued and might have proved clairvoyant were human nature a bit less base than it is.
Human nature gets in the way.
This is why, because of the flaws in human nature, amplified by divisions imposed by geography, a writer like Mahan wears so much better over the decades than one like Angel. It points to the enduring relevance of realism in a world where human nature often dictates conflict over perceived rationality.
It's fascinating how ideas travel and find new homes, almost like a philosophical migration.
No.
Mahan's theories, born in the West, in the context of Western naval power, are now finding their most ardent supporters in an unexpected place,
Yeah.
the East, specifically India and China.
That's a significant sign of how global power dynamics are shifting and why Mahan is more relevant than ever. Kaplan points out that Indian and Chinese strategists avidly read Mahan. They, much more than the Americans, are the Mahanians now.
They are the Mahanians now.
Yeah. These nations are building fleets designed for armed encounters at sea, starkly contrasting with, say, European navies that view sea power only in terms of constabulary action, like policing or humanitarian missions, not grand strategic power projection.
So while some traditional Western maritime powers might be scaling back or rethinking, these rising Eastern powers are leaning full tilt into Mahan's more assertive, dominance-focused approach. This isn't just academic interest then. It's driving real-world naval buildups.
Exactly. For example, a 2004 symposium in Beijing saw scholar after scholar quoted Mahan, attesting to his influence on Chinese strategic thought.
Wow.
And significantly, almost without exception, they quoted the most bellicose sounding of Mahan's precepts, equating command of the sea to overbearing power that closes the maritime common to an enemy's flag.
The overbearing power concept.
And since then, as the Chinese Navy becomes larger and more wide-ranging, the bent toward Mahan has only intensified in Beijing, especially with the rise of Indian sea power, which the Chinese clearly fear. And the Indians, for their part, view the Chinese in similar Mahanian terms.
A mutual Mahanian view.
You see this playing out in the South China Sea, in the Indian Ocean. A clear focus on projecting power, securing sea lanes, denying access to rivals. It's a clear indication that Mahans' ideas about sea power dominance are being actively adopted and implemented by emerging global powers, driving a new kind of naval arms race.
This is where it gets really interesting because we have China and India embracing a very strong Mahanian stance, almost like new students of the master.
Right.
But the American Navy, surprisingly, appears to have shifted its own strategic emphasis away from pure Mahanian dominance. Instead, they seem to be looking to another thinker from Mahans' era, Julian Corbett.
Corbett, yes.
Who was Corbett, and how did his approach differ from Mahans'?
That's a crucial pivot in understanding modern naval strategy. Julian Corbett was a British historian and strategist, same era as Mahan, but he offered a distinct counterpoint. Corbett did not so much disagree with Mahan as offer a subtler approach to naval strategy.
Subtle or how?
Placing greater emphasis on doing more at sea with fewer ships. He was less about achieving that overwhelming absolute dominance through brute force and more about strategic effectiveness through nuanced application of naval power, often in limited ways.
So he offered a different take on how control of the sea works. What was his key challenge to Mahans' ideas about who controls the seas? And how did he introduce this concept of a fleet in being?
Corbett challenged one of Mahan's core assumptions. Mahan, in his more, let's say, simplistic view, believed that if one nation lost control of the sea, another automatically gained it, like a zero-sum game.
Right.
Corbett asserted that just because one nation has lost control of the sea, another nation has not necessarily gained it. This opens up a more complex understanding of maritime power, where control can be contested or even shared in different ways.
More shades of gray.
Exactly. Corbett proposed that a naval coalition, even if appearing weak and dispersed, can, if properly constituted, have a reality of strength. He called this a fleet in being.
Fleet in being.
A collection of ships that, by their mere existence and strategic positioning, can quickly coalesce into an effective fleet when necessary, without needing to be a permanent, massed battle fleet like Mahan envisioned.
That's a very different strategic philosophy. So this fleet in being wouldn't necessarily seek to utterly destroy or dominate other fleets like Mahan's overbearing power might suggest? Sounds more about deterrence and flexible response.
Precisely. This fleet in being would not need to dominate or sink other fleets. It could be effective by seizing bases and policing choke points, or simply by posing a credible threat that shapes enemy behavior.
Presence matters.
Such a deceptively able fleet, Corbett argued, should pursue an active and vigorous life in conducting limited defense. This was particularly relevant in his context. Corbett's book emerged after the British Royal Navy had strategically reduced its worldwide presence by leveraging the growing sea power of its allies, Japan and the United States.
Oh, Britain was already doing this.
It was a recognition that absolute dominance isn't always feasible or necessary, and cooperation and strategic positioning can be powerful force multipliers, achieving objectives without constant, overwhelming presence.
This historical parallel is striking. Britain, a dominant naval power, adjusting its strategy through cooperation. How does Corbett's philosophy apply to the modern U.S. Navy, given its current situation and challenges?
Well, the U.S. is now in a position similar to that of Britain 100 years ago. The American Navy has been getting smaller in number.
Significantly small.
Yeah, from around 600 ships during the Cold War, down to 350 in the 90s, about 280 now, and maybe possibly going down to 250 in the coming years. Budget cuts, evolving threats.
So they had to do more with less.
Pretty much. As such, the U.S. Navy is embracing naval allies such as India, Japan, Australia, and Singapore, nations that are increasingly vital maritime powers themselves. It's not just a choice anymore, it's a strategic necessity to maintain global influence with a smaller fleet.
And this shift towards cooperation, away from pure dominance, is reflected in their official strategy documents, right?
It is. The U.S. Navy published a document back in October 2007 titled A Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power.
Cooperative strategy. The name says a lot.
It really does. And it's clearly more in the spirit of Corbett with its emphasis on cooperation than of Mahan with its emphasis on dominance. The document explicitly states, our nation's interests are best served by fostering a peaceful global system comprised of interdependent networks of trade, finance, information, law, people, and governance.
That sounds like a fundamental departure from the idea of one nation having overbearing power. Very different from Mahan. What else does this modern U.S. Navy strategy emphasize about the global environment?
It emphasizes a shift in understanding global stability. The U.S. Navy sees our world as increasingly interconnected, with the global population clustered in pulsing demographic ganglia near the seas.
Pulsing demographic ganglia. Interesting phrase.
That will be prone to great disruptions, such as asymmetric attacks and natural disasters. Even great power conflicts, the document says, are apt to be subtle and asymmetric.
Subtle and asymmetric, meaning
Less about head-on fleet battles and more about, cyber warfare, proxy conflicts, targeted disruptions. There is little talk here of conventional sea and land battles in the traditional sense.
And what about China?
What's particularly notable is that the growing naval power of China is not even mentioned explicitly in this document.
Not mentioned at all. That's striking.
A strategic silence that speaks volumes. The spirit of collective security is everywhere, acknowledging that no one nation has the resources required to provide safety throughout the entire maritime domain. This signals a profound shift towards shared responsibility through partnerships.
Collective security, shared responsibility.
And in this evolving maritime domain, the document indicates that the Western Pacific and Indian Oceans will be the first among equals in strategic importance, underscoring their ongoing critical role as the new strategic centers.
So we have this fascinating divergence. A cooperative U.S. strategy, largely in the spirit of Corbett, contrasting sharply with a more assertive Mahanian approach from rising powers like China and India.
Right. Two different paths.
What does this mean for the future of global power, especially in that critical Eurasian rimland that Mahan identified as the debatable ground?
It means that the rimland of Eurasia and the larger world promontory, to use the phraseology of Spikeman and Mackinder, will essentially have two military realities playing out simultaneously.
Two realities.
On one hand, there's the U.S. Navy, with its declining but still dominant fleet, patrolling, in the spirit of Corbett, in concert with its local allies from Africa to Northeast Asia, in order to keep the seas safe for commerce. That represents a collaborative approach, focusing on shared interests and stability.
Okay, the cooperative model and the countervailing force, the other reality.
On the other hand, there's the assertion of rising power by China primarily and India secondarily, each armed with their Mahanian proclivities.
Back to Mahan.
Back to Mahan. They are building fleets with a clear intent for asserting overbearing power in their regions, South China Sea, Indian Ocean beyond. They're investing heavily in carriers, advanced destroyers, long-range subs, all designed to project force and secure dominance.
And the irony here is...
The irony is profound. Precisely because the Chinese have welcomed this American icon of imperialist ambition, adopting his strategies for their own rise. The U.S. Navy will not be able to escape entirely from his spirit. Even if the U.S. embraces Corbett, Mahan's ideas, through their adoption by others, are still shaping the strategic environment the U.S. Navy operates in. The eternal struggle of power politics goes on, as much as we might want to escape from it.
This brings us back to the fundamental nature of power politics and the analysis of thinkers like University of Chicago political scientist John Mearsheimer.
Mearsheimer, yeah. Offensive realism.
Is Mahan's vision of power and expansion, this drive for dominance, truly inescapable for great powers, regardless of our desire for cooperation?
Mearsheimer offers a compelling and frankly sobering perspective, he argues. To argue that expansion is inherently misguided implies that all great powers over the past 350 years have failed to comprehend how the international system works. This is an implausible argument on its face.
Basically saying great powers expand. It's what they do.
He goes on to state that since the security benefits of hegemony are enormous in an anarchic system where there is no world hegemon to enforce peace.
Right, no global 9/11.
Powerful states will invariably be tempted to emulate the United States and try to dominate their region of the world. This suggests that Mahan's best days may lie ahead. Not necessarily for the U.S., perhaps, but as a guiding philosophy for other rising powers seeking regional dominance and the security they believe comes with it.
The structure of international relations itself pushes states towards a Mahanian mindset.
That's the argument.
So even with talk of cooperation and collective security, the underlying temptations of power, the pursuit of national security in an anarchic world, will likely keep Mahan's ideas alive and well. Looking ahead, what does this mean for the world's oceans and the pace of global competition?
Well, Kaplan suggests that with a Eurasian littoral increasingly crowded with warships in order to accommodate the ambitions of the Chinese, Indians, and others alongside the U.S.,
Crowded seas.
and even as an ever more practical polar route cuts distances between Eurasia and North America, a new geographic wrinkle Mahan never could have imagined, opening entirely new strategic passages.
The Arctic opening up.
Worldwide hegemonic struggles may only quicken in speed and intensity. The maritime domain, far from becoming a realm of pure cooperation, looks set to become an even more active and potentially contested arena for strategic competition.
We've explored how Alfred Mahan's century-old ideas on sea power continue to resonate, profoundly shaping the geopolitical calculations of nations from Washington to Beijing.
Absolutely.
His insights into geography, national character, the inherent advantages of maritime control, they're proving remarkably durable, even as some nations lean into his dominance-focused strategies and others pursue more cooperative approaches.
It's a testament to the enduring power of geographical realities in shaping human affairs and, well, the timeless nature of strategic thought.
And as the global oceans become increasingly crowded with both cooperative fleets and those driven by Mahanian ambition, and with new routes like the Polar Passage shortening distances and opening up previously inaccessible areas, what does this mean for the future of global stability? Will the overbearing power on the sea ultimately prevail as the dominant paradigm? Or can a new era of genuine cooperation truly redefine the hinges of geopolitical destiny? What role do you think sea power will play in shaping the world you live in? And how would you view the oceans the next time you see a map? It's definitely a question worth pondering as we navigate the complex currents of global power.